Well, I guess to ask about what you were talking about with your first project, with your first book,
Yeah.
I guess the question that I was going to come up with or present next was this idea of internalized oppression, internalized colonization, and how that manifests. And I know in reading your interview with Matt in America, you talk
Hmm.
about the English language in particular and how that is a signifier of economic prosperity or career opportunities.
Hmm.
There's this internalized idea that I guess colonized or post-colonized populations have within a
Hmm.
neo-colonial, or excuse me, a neoliberal kind of global
Hmm.
economic structure. We have to also include
Yeah.
that. That speaking this language, which is a symbol of the legacy of colonization. I mean, speaking English is a part of that.
Right.
So I just wanted to
Yeah.
ask about the identity of those that are living in a kind of post-colonial context, that have internalized some of those,
Hmm.
they internalized the values of the colonizers, I guess you could say. Yeah.
I think one project that might be helpful even today to especially speak about the protests that are happening, in the aftermath of the tragic aftermath of George Floyd's killing and killing of, Breonna Taylor's and so many others, is being sort of how one of the questions has been asked is how does um, what is the role of South Asians or Indians, how they're complicit in advancing anti-blackness or white supremacy? How can they undo that? How can they speak about racism within their own communities? And that was, I think, one way that I can speak very clearly, or I can speak in some depth to the question you're asking about um, sort of the influence of not just languages I can come back to it, but also understanding of social caste hierarchies, how they shape, for example, the immigrant diaspora or the South Asian diaspora. And then when they're placed here within the context of racial formation, racial hierarchies in the United States, how they respond to that. So let me kind of make it more concrete to you, is that um, um, large segments, of so-called Asian Americans and also South Asians who live within the United States, who are very highly educated, came after 1965, who are very highly educated in the sense they were doctors and engineers, and they were able to in some ways start out at a very different point as opposed to other migrants, other Black communities and other migrants, such as Latino migrants. And so there's always been an unequal starting point in terms of how some of these Asian Americans have done well in terms of their median income. And one way to look at that is to kind of think about, why is that the case? There's usually an understanding that somehow these immigrant communities have been able to advance themselves, have a piece of the American dream, and they're compared unfairly. Should they compare to other communities and say, look, these other communities, other racial communities have been here for hundreds of years, but they somehow have not done as well as Asian Americans. So this was in the 1960s, politicians used this model minority politics to create a wedge between these different groups without acknowledging that many of the South Asians came in the 1960s had a very distinct advantage in terms of their education. So they didn't come essentially as working class labor and lived here in structural racism and very disadvantaged life. They came here with professional degrees and were propelled through a system that allowed them to really acquire social mobility. So part of answering that question is that, so what are the ways in which then South Asians have been explicit or have been entangled in the project of white supremacy, is to sort of not acknowledge that their advancement has come on the fights and struggles of people of color, Black people specifically, who fought, who gave their labor, who made this country over 400 years, fought in the civil rights movement, and provided the space for other groups, so to speak, to other immigrant groups to come in. So part of my book, American Karma, really asks this question, is not just about model minority, but how, like, what does silence mean? What does, what does it mean to be silenced to white supremacy by benefiting from it? What does it mean to be indifferent to your own, so to speak, economic privileges? I'm not suggesting that the South Asians do not experience racism or so. But what I point out in my book, there's a paradox there. And the paradox is that many of the South Asians in my book spoke about the racism because of this. I have a chapter called Saris, Chutney Sandwiches, and Thick